Hello and welcome to the Bloomington Early Music Festival's performance by Schola Antiqua called Music in Secret. I'm Cesar Favila and I'm joined in this pre-concert conversation with performer scholar Dr. Naomi Gregory. Dr. Gregory performs widely as an organist and harpsichordist, working with period ensembles including Incantate, Pegasus Early Music, Public Musique, and as guest director of the Schola Antiqua of Chicago, as we will observe in today's performance. She's a lecturer in music in the Arthur Zatz Department of Music at the University of Rochester. Naomi holds a PhD degree in musicology and, incredibly, a second doctoral degree, a DMA degree in organ performance and literature, both from the Eastman School of Music. Previously, she earned degrees in music and musicology from the University of Cambridge. Her PhD dissertation explores the 5- and 6-voice motet at the Royal French Court in the early 16th century and its role in the performance and practices of royal piety. Her DMA lecture recital presented a reconstruction of Vespers from mid-17th century Rome, featuring the Italian Baroque organ at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, New York. For many years, Naomi curated a monthly concert series showcasing this instrument, which we will hear in today's performance. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you.
So I have to tell you, I am a forever student of the organ. I love the pipe organ, and I took lessons on and off in college and in graduate school. And I even had master classes with your teacher, David Higgs, which was an amazing experience. So I have to ask about this organ we're going to hear. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how this instrument is not your typical pipe organ that you hear in performance halls and in churches, even if from a distance it looks like most organs. So let's talk a little bit about that and maybe why this instrument is so well suited to accompany the repertory that we'll hear in this concert.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really special instrument. It's actually the only full-size Italian Baroque organ here in North America. There are other smaller organs around, chamber organs that were 17th or 18th century Italian instruments, but this is really the only full-size one. And that makes it a really wonderful instrument for working with in concerts, because not only does it have the tonal colors to accompany and support the singers or instrumentalists very well, but there's a whole range of color palette there that is really extraordinary to an audience. The sound is very vivid, very live in the room. And then you have this really unusual and wonderful situation where this organ is situated in a gallery that is full of Italian Baroque art as well. So the experience is kind of visually and musically immersive. So just to talk a little bit about one of the reasons it works so well, the primary sound that I'm using for accompanying is what we call the principale, the 8-foot. Now, when you go to concerts, often with early music ensembles, for a range of logistical reasons, people are often using continuo box organs, as we would call them. And the primary sound there, the sound that's the base of your sound, is usually an 8-foot flute stop, a gadact. This is a little technical, but it's a very soft sound. It doesn't have a lot of color. The Italian principale has more higher harmonics, it has more body, and it's fantastic to sing into and to tune with.
So one of the interesting things that I recall from continuo organs is that, as you mentioned, it's small, it's a box. It doesn't typically have pedals, does it? But I think I saw that this organ from a distance has some semblance of pedals, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It does have, it has pedals which are pull downs from the keyboard with an extra, we would call it the 16-foot. It's like in the orchestra where you add the double bass. And actually this organ it's not really remarkable. If you look at some of the more important convents or monasteries and obviously churches in Italy, this is the scale of organ that they were using there. So for example, the very well-known San Maurizio in Milan, one of the most important female Benedictine convents, that had a very large organ, larger than what we see there, with a larger range, what we'd call a 12-foot organ, where the bass doesn't just stop at the low C, goes all the way down to the F. So we're really working with an instrument that's very close to what we might imagine certainly in the most well-supported convents and religious institutions.
Wonderful. So speaking of convents, I have to ask you then about this really thought-provoking title for the concert, Music in Secret. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that title. Maybe if you can tell us what the secret is.
I could just say it's a secret, right?
Of course you can. And we can wait to be surprised, but
no,
what do you think?
Of course, what we're referring to is the circumstances of the production and the making of the music. So these are nuns in cloistered communities. So this whole trope around this, right? Nuns, music making, secret, cloistered. You can only have access to it if you're within that community or you have access to that community. But it's interesting because this tends to lead us towards an idea of restriction. Okay, the nuns' lives were restricted in this way. This is all happening within the convent, but of course it's a place of great creativity and space for that. And the placing of all these musical resources to write this devotional music is absolutely at the heart of what the nuns are doing all the time, every day.
Great. Well, your mention of devotional context is a really good starting point for the next question that I had, which is that we're going to be hearing you perform and seeing you perform in this museum gallery. So I wonder if we could take a further step into the original sacred context of these works. We have, for example, a series of vocal works called motets and even some things called responsories that we'll be hearing. So what types of liturgical and devotional services might we have heard these pieces in originally, Naomi?
Yeah, thank you. So this is a very rich question, in part because our program spans several hundred years. The earliest music we're featuring comes from a 13th century chant source from an Italian convent. And then we go all the way through to some of the published polyphony or motets from the early 17th century. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in on a couple of places to talk about here. So early on in the program, you'll see the singers perform two responsory chants. And this is from a really beautiful Italian convent manuscript that's held at the Art Institute in Chicago, beautifully decorated by the artist Jacopo de Salerno. And what we did in this concert was we had the singers sing from original notation. So when you watch the video, you'll see that off to the left on the screen. And so I thought maybe our audience might be interested to see the notation that the singers are singing from. This is a responsory chant. It would be sung in matins as part of the office, the daily services.
That
so
sounds fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. Throw it up there. Let's see what it looks like.
Going to just share that up for us now. So about halfway down the screen, you can see this beautiful illuminated M, Missus S. Gabriel. This is the first chant that the singers were singing. And really, I was very lucky in that ensemble to have singers who are capable of reading this notation and comfortable to do that, even in a concert setting. That's a rather different proposition than in rehearsal. So this is what they were singing from. And of course, so much of the daily ritual life was to be singing chants in the many services that were, or devotional activities that were happening throughout the day. But if we move to the second half of our program, a lot of the music we've got in there is from the late 16th, early 17th century, and we have some different motets. Some of them are polyphonic for multiple voices, and we also have a couple of solo motets. And then again, there are a range of contexts that these motets could have turned up in. So if we think about the Mass service, it's certainly possible that the motets could have been sung in the Mass at certain points. We could also have motets being sung in office services such as Vespers as well. even the solo motets, sometimes that's a little harder for people to kind of put their heads around these early 17th century motets, the solo ones that are very soloistic, we might say, right, virtuosic, and have these very vivid Song of Songs texts. But we can still imagine these being performed in devotional contexts, whether that's the regular services of the office or the mass, or some of the different special devotional services that were being observed throughout the day.
So not to get to textbook vocabulary here, but these would have been used, I suppose, for the proper of the mass. What are these motets would be specific to the feast, would you say, that was being celebrated that day?
Yeah, absolutely. So so in that sense, their text is going to coordinate with the other readings that are assigned for the day. Yeah, and they can substitute, you see, for the chant item, maybe for the antiphon, just as actually organ pieces could, or instrumental pieces could also.
Well, I'm so glad you brought back up the organ, because obviously I don't want to focus too much on it just because I love the organ, but I have to ask, since you are performing some organ solos, you know, a lot of early music enthusiasts might recognize the name toccata from perhaps having heard the famous toccatas and fugues by Johann Sebastian Bach, which came obviously much later than the toccata you perform in this concert. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what a toccata is and what it was used for. Likewise with the other solo, canzoni alla francese, which for our audience means French songs. So what would Italian cloistered nuns have used these organ solos for?
Yeah, so the Pasquini toccata that you hear is relatively short. It's played on what we call the ripieno, the full organ sound. And this is still connectable to maybe the famous Bach toccata in D minor, right? The toccata has a sense of outlining, well, the toccata, first of all, often has quite active figuration, and you'll see often once the piece gets going, there's quite a lot of passage work in the right hand, sometimes in the left hand. But we're on a much smaller scale here. And in terms of the function of the music, we know that this kind of toccata could well have been played or improvised, of course, for the beginning of the service, perhaps as a processional entrance of the clergy. There are also instructions from the time, for example, Banchieri, the composer of the other organ piece, the canzona, tells the organist, for example, if you play at mass, at the end play something short but full organ. So this is the kind of piece we can imagine at the beginning or end of the service. But there are also other contexts we might imagine using this piece. If you are in maybe a Vespers service and you have a motet, perhaps you want to use the staccato as a way to introduce the motet to set the tone, the mode of the motet for the singers. The other useful thing about these kind of toccata is they tend to move around tonalities, or at least patterns of fifth related chords that would also allow, if there are any instrumentalists, to kind of subtly tune their strings, to check their tuning against these chords that you hear in the toccata. So these very short toccatas could serve a range of purposes within one of these office or mass services.
Oh, how fascinating. So you had the instrumentalists that are just kind of quietly trying to tune their instruments while the organ was going.
Could do. It's at least possible. If you look at it, you have all the right notes in the chords that the toccata tends to be, it's a little bit like a sequence of pillars, different chords, and then they're connected by passage work. But to talk about the canzona, this comes from, actually, it's a publication in Venice in the late 16th century. And here you have 4-part books, canto, altus, tenor, and bassus. So these could be performed by instruments. But what was very common at the time was for organists also to play such instrumental canzonas on the organ as well. So that's what I'm doing here. And again, I brought a visual aid for our audience. But before I show you that, just to speak a little bit about where could a canzona turn up in the service? Well, there are 2 points specifically that we know about from the sources: after the epistle, after the first reading, and also after communion as well. The organist is invited to play a canzona. So this is one place we could imagine this canzona being heard. but I did mention a visual aid. Would you like to see that?
Absolutely. We love visual aids.
Excellent. So here, if you look on the right-hand side of the page, this is the canto. It's the soprano voice, the top part of this 4-part canzona. And we can see the title down here. It's the 11th canzona. And it has this rather intriguing kind of subtitle, La Organistina Bella. And then up here, you can see in the top left, in echo. And this is a fun part of this canzona that the audience will hear in the video. It begins as just like any regular canzona word with a 4-part imitative kind of sequence of paragraphs, but then in the middle of the piece it goes into this back and forth echo. And this was one of the reasons I programmed this piece in the concert program, because it allowed me to show some of the different colors of the organ. So the opening and the closing sections, the polyphonic canzona, you'll hear the principale with the flauto in duodecima. This is a nice color sound. And then for the echoes, the stronger part, which is actually, as you can see here on the part, is actually marked forte. I'm using the tromboncini, which is a very characteristic reed sound. And then I'm answering that every time we have a piano with the 4-foot flute, which is a very sweet, soft little sound. And it's kind of cool. The audience can see here we have the F for the forte, the P for the piano, and so on.
Oh, how fascinating. Wow. I really look forward to hearing those dynamic contrasts and timbral contrasts too. Wonderful. So lastly, I wonder if you can tell us a thing or two about some of the female composers in this program, because students of music history often hear about Hildegard of Bingen, who will also feature in the performance. But what about Raffaella Aleotti and Lucrezia Vizzanna? It's quite rare for women at this time to become composers, isn't it? So what did it take for them to be able to learn to compose and even to publish some of their works within their lifetime?
Yeah, maybe I can speak a little bit about Aleotti. She actually studied as a young girl with Ercole Pasquini. That's why his music is on the program. That's the toccata that I'm playing on the organ. And it's immediately followed by a motet by Aleotti. And we know that she studied harpsichord, organ, composition with him, and she was extremely talented at that. And then age 14, she entered the convent San Vito in Ferrara, where then she spent the rest of her life. And really, she was a particularly remarkable figure because she has the first printed musical, first printed publication by a named nun. It's the first collection of sacred music by a woman composer to be published. So it was really great to have a chance to represent her on the program. Another one of the nun composers from the early 17th century that we have there is Vizzanna. And again, my connection with the organ piece is that Adriano Banchieri, who was himself a brother in a religious community, was publishing a lot of different music, sacred music, and some of his publications he actually dedicated to Vizzanna's convent, which gives us an idea perhaps of the standard of music making there. These women composers, these nuns, are really turning out music that's at least as wonderful as all the other music maybe that we learn about more often, sacred music that's being produced by male composers around this period. And it was really something very wonderful about the invitation to put this program together, was to feature repertoire that isn't maybe so canonical, we don't get a chance to hear so often, in that remarkable space at the art gallery, surrounded by other artistic products of their time, and with this really beautiful Italian Baroque organ.
How wonderful. I'm really excited to hear about that connection with the composer, the organ composer. Some of the music that I research from New Spanish convents, well, we don't have pieces composed by women. We have pieces that were sung by nuns, by particular composers who we know had daughters and relatives in the convents where we have some of their extant music. So of course, those networks existed. Of course, that's what was making this music resound in these secretive spaces, as you've mentioned earlier. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation and one that I think will certainly give audiences much to look forward to in our subsequent performance. Naomi, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. It has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.